Nobody approached Clara Bennett at the gala. She was a stranger in soul. No connections, no alliances, no reason for anyone to notice her. But a little girl noticed her. 7 years old, dressed in a yellow jacket with pearl buttons, eyes carrying something far too heavy for a child that age. She crossed the entire room, looked up at Clara, and whispered, "Can I sit with you?" In 20 minutes, that little girl would hand Clara a secret so dangerous, it would send her straight into the heart of Seoul's most feared mafia estate. They say it's dangerous to be a woman alone in a room full of sharks, until you realize you're the one holding the blade. If you've ever wondered what happens when you mind your business, but trouble finds you anyway, welcome. If you're listening right now, help me prove my colleague wrong. They swore this channel wouldn't hit 1,000 subscribers, but I know these stories of justice and resilience matter. Hit that subscribe button and show them that great storytelling has a home here. Clara Bennett had not come to Seoul to collect problems. She had come to collect money. Specifically, she had come to close 3 business deals: gold, luxury fashion, high-end accessories. The kind of inventory that made women feel dangerous and look expensive. She was very good at her job. She was even better at minding her business. And she had every intention of leaving Seoul exactly the way she arrived, unbothered, profitable, and entirely drama-free. The gala was not even on her original schedule. Her business contact, David, had called her that afternoon sounding like he'd just discovered a cheat code. An invitation had come through one of their Seoul connections, a high-profile event, the kind of room where the right introduction could unlock doors that 100 cold emails never could. Clara had stood at her hotel window for a long moment, watching the Han River move slow and indifferent below her, before she said yes. She packed her teal wrap dress, structured, floor-length, deeply serious, the kind of dress that introduced her before she opened her mouth. Then she showed up. The venue was magnificent in that quiet, intimidating way that genuinely expensive places always are. Chandeliers hanging like suspended golden fire, men in suits that had never once touched a sale rack, conversations layered in Korean, English, and something in between. Clara had been in rooms like this before. She was not impressed. She was also not particularly comfortable. She knew nobody knew her, and the canapés were, frankly, a disappointment. She found herself a corner, her natural habitat at events like this. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server, settled in, and began to observe. People watching was essentially a free hobby, and Clara was exceptionally good at it. That was when she noticed him. Gan Young-hee stood near the center of the room like a man who had never once in his life questioned whether he belonged somewhere. He wasn't the loudest person at the gala. He didn't need to be. People simply arranged themselves around him instinctively, without seeming to realize they were doing it. Tall, composed, a dark suit that fit like a decision, a face that gave away absolutely nothing. Not unkind exactly, more like a door with no handle. Beside him stood a woman, beautiful in that high-maintenance, deliberate way. Her hand rested on his arm. She laughed at all the right moments. She leaned into him with a practiced ease that looked almost real. Clara clocked them both, filed them neatly under "not my business," and moved on. What caught her eye next was sitting alone at a small table near the edge of the room. A little girl, 7 years old at most. A yellow jacket with tiny pearl buttons. Clara's trained eye registered the craftsmanship immediately. That was not something pulled off a department store rack. The child's legs dangled above the floor, and she was surveying the room with the calm, unimpressed expression of someone who had seen far too much for her age. Clara watched her for a moment. Nobody was watching the child back. Not the bodyguards stationed around the perimeter. Not the woman on Gan Young-hee's arm. Not Gan himself, who was deep in conversation with 2 older men, his expression closed and unreadable. Then the little girl turned her head and looked directly at Clara. It was the kind of look that had no business coming from a 7-year-old. Steady, measuring, like she was making a careful decision about something important. Clara held the gaze. She wasn't entirely sure why. After a long moment, the child looked away first. Clara went back to her champagne. She was mid-sip when she felt it, a small, deliberate tug at the fabric of her dress. She looked down. The little girl was standing right beside her, small hands folded neatly in front of her. She had crossed the entire gala floor, past bodyguards, past her father's associates, past every important, powerful person in that room, and stopped here, right next to Clara Bennett, a woman she had never met in her life. She looked up and whispered, "Can I sit with you?" Clara blinked. "Where are your parents?" The little girl glanced briefly toward Gan Young-hee across the room, then back at Clara. "My father is busy." Clara looked around, waiting for someone to come rushing over, a nanny, an aide, a bodyguard, anyone. Nobody moved. Nobody was even looking their way. She pulled out the chair beside her. "Sit." Jae-sung sat down and smoothed her jacket over her knees with the composure of someone twice her age. Then she studied Clara's face with open, unhurried curiosity. "You're not Korean," she said. "Very observant," Clara said. "I'm not." "You came alone." "Also correct." "You're not afraid of anything in this room." Clara tilted her head. "What makes you say that?" "Because everyone else is," Jae-sung said simply. "But you're just sitting in your corner drinking your drink like this is a normal party." Clara laughed, genuine, warm, slightly too loud for their quiet corner. She didn't mind. "And what's your name, little observer?" "Jae-sung," a small pause. "Jae-sung Gan." Clara Bennett had not come to Seoul to collect problems, but something about the way this child said her own name, like it was a thing that carried weight she hadn't asked for, made Clara set her glass down and give the girl her full attention. "Clara Bennett," she said. "Nice to meet you, Jae-sung." Jae-sung nodded, as though the introduction was merely a formality, and they both already understood that this conversation was headed somewhere that mattered. They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence for a few minutes. Clara watched the room. Jae-sung watched her father across the gala floor, that composed, unreachable man with an expression Clara couldn't quite name. Not longing, exactly. Something older and more complicated than that. "Is that your father?" Clara asked quietly. "Yes," Jae-sung said. "He looks important." "He is." A pause. "That's the problem." Clara glanced at her. "What do you mean?" Jae-sung didn't answer immediately. She was watching the woman beside her father, Sora, lift a small, private bottle from her clutch and refill Gan Young-hee's glass. She watched Sora smile up at him as he accepted it, her hand grazing his briefly, deliberately. Jae-sung's small hands tightened in her lap. Then she looked up at Clara, and for the first time the composure cracked. Just slightly, just enough. "She's hurting him," Jae-sung whispered, "and nobody believes me." Clara felt something shift in her chest. She had built her entire professional life on the discipline of not getting involved, of keeping her lane clean and her exits clear. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. But she was looking into the eyes of a 7-year-old who had carried something unbearable completely alone, and walked across an entire room of strangers to find the one person she somehow sensed might actually listen. Clara picked up her glass, set it back down. She looked at Jae-sung Gan, daughter of Seoul's most feared man, and made the worst, most inevitable decision of her entire trip. "Tell me everything." Clara did not sleep that night. She lay in her hotel room with the Han River glittering through the floor-to-ceiling window, and Jae-sung's words arranged themselves over and over in her mind like evidence she hadn't asked to collect. "She's hurting him, and nobody believes me. 7 years old. Hands folded neatly in her lap. Voice steady in that particular way that children's voices get steady when they've had to repeat something important to too many adults who looked right past them." Clara had listened. She had asked the right questions, kept her face neutral, kept her voice calm. Jae-sung had told her everything she knew in the precise, careful way of a child who understood that details mattered, the private bottle Sora always brought. The way her father's hands had started to tremble on certain mornings, the headaches he dismissed, the fatigue he explained away, the doctor visits that Sora always managed to attend and always managed to summarize before Gan Young-hee could speak for himself. Then, One of the bodyguards had appeared at Jai Sung's elbow with the quiet urgency of someone who had been searching for a while, and the child had stood, smoothed her jacket, and looked at Clara one last time with those impossible eyes. She hadn't said please help. She hadn't needed to. Clara had watched her walk back across the gala floor and had sat very still for a long time afterward with an untouched glass of champagne and the specific, nauseating feeling of a woman who knows something she cannot unknow. That was the problem, she thought now, staring at the ceiling. You couldn't unreceive information. You couldn't fold it back up and return it to a 7-year-old who had nowhere else to put it. The moment Jai Sung had whispered those words into the warm, chandelier-lit air between them, the information had become Clara's to carry. That was simply how it worked. She had never asked for it. It didn't matter. She turned onto her side and looked at her phone. 2:14 a.m. She had 3 meetings tomorrow. A gold supplier in Mapo, a fashion distributor in Gangnam, an accessories contact near Itaewon. She had a flight back to London in 6 days. She had a business to run, margins to protect, a professional reputation that had taken her a decade to build without anyone's help. She closed her eyes. Jai Sung's hands tightening in her lap. Clara sat up. She was not a woman who made impulsive decisions. She was not a woman who inserted herself into other people's crises. She was structured, deliberate, and allergic to unnecessary risk. She had built her entire life on those 3 qualities, and they had served her exceptionally well. But there was a difference. She understood now in the dark quiet of a Seoul hotel room, between being a woman who minded her business and being a woman who looked away. She had always been the former. She refused to become the latter. So, the question was not whether to act. The question was how. She reached for her laptop. By the time pale gray light was beginning to soften the edges of the city skyline, Clara had a plan. She kept her morning meetings, all 3 of them. She was professional and focused and closed 2 of the 3 deals before noon, which was, honestly, on brand. Then she went back to her hotel, ordered coffee she barely tasted, and made a single phone call to a contact she hadn't used in 4 years. A woman named Adiz who operated in the quiet, useful space between corporate intelligence and things that didn't have a formal name. Adiz asked no unnecessary questions. That was why Clara liked her. By evening, she had what she needed. The Gan estate employed rotating domestic staff through a private agency called Heroines Staffing. Exclusive, discreet, the kind of agency that placed workers in households where confidentiality wasn't a preference. It was a condition of employment. There was, Adiz informed her, a position that had opened 3 days ago. A household coordinator role, live-in, responsible for scheduling, inventory, and overseeing the daily logistics of a large private residence. The previous coordinator had left abruptly. The agency was under pressure to fill the vacancy quickly because the Gan household did not tolerate gaps in operational precision. Clara looked at this information for a long moment. She was a businesswoman. She negotiated multi-currency gold contracts. She had once talked a Parisian supplier down 40% over a single lunch because she understood leverage better than most people understood their own names. She was not, by any reasonable definition, domestic staff. But she was meticulous. She was composed under pressure. She could manage a complex operational environment with her eyes half closed. And more importantly, she could construct a professional profile that would survive scrutiny because she understood exactly what scrutiny was looking for. She opened a new document and got to work. The Heroines Staffing Agency occupied a quiet office building in Seongbuk-gu, all clean lines, and the kind of minimalist interior that communicated seriousness without trying too hard. Clara arrived the following morning in a charcoal trouser suit, authoritative, but understated, the visual language of someone reliable, with a curated portfolio that reflected a decade of high-end operational management across multiple industries, and 3 letters of professional reference that Adiz had arranged with impressive efficiency and 0 questions. The woman who interviewed her was named Ms. Cho. Mid-50s, reading glasses on a fine chain, the measured energy of someone who had seen every variety of candidate and was difficult to impress. She reviewed Clara's documents with the careful neutrality of a professional who understood that the households she served required a particular standard. "Your background is primarily commercial," Ms. Cho observed, not looking up. "It is," Clara said, "which means I understand precision, discretion, and the management of complex systems under significant pressure. A private household at this level is an operational environment. I treat it accordingly." Ms. Cho looked up then, studied her. "The position requires full residential compliance. You would live on the estate grounds. Your movements would be structured. The principal values order." "I prefer order," Clara said simply. A pause. Ms. Cho set the portfolio down with the deliberate care of someone who had already made a decision, but was not yet ready to confirm it aloud. "You understand," she said, "that discretion in this particular placement is not a preference. It is absolute." "Ms. Cho," Clara said, "I have never once in my professional life confused confidentiality with a guideline." Another pause, longer this time. "We will conduct a background verification, standard procedure." "Of course. If everything clears, and I expect it will, you would begin Monday." Clara nodded, composed, her hands still in her lap. Inside, something steady and focused locked into place. Not excitement, not fear, something colder and more useful than either of those things. She called her business partner back in London that evening and explained, efficiently, that she would be extending her sole stay by a matter of weeks due to a significant and unexpected opportunity she was in the process of securing. Her partner, who had worked with her long enough to know that unexpected opportunities in Clara's hands generally became profitable ones, asked 3 sensible questions and then accepted the explanation without protest. Clara did not mention the gala. She did not mention Jai Sung. She did not mention the private bottle or the trembling hands or the particular quality of a child's voice when it carries something unbearable completely alone. Some information, she understood, you protected by keeping it small and close. The moment you spread it out, it became a thing other people could shape. She wasn't prepared to let anyone else shape this. She stood at her window again that night, the Han River below doing what rivers do, moving steadily forward, indifferent to everything on the banks, committed entirely to its own direction. Monday, she thought. She had 6 days to learn everything publicly available about the Gan estate's layout, household structure, staff hierarchy, and operational patterns. 6 days to build a version of herself that could exist inside those walls without triggering a single alarm in the mind of a man whose instincts had presumably kept him alive long enough to become the most feared figure in Seoul's underworld. 6 days to become invisible enough to see everything. She turned from the window, opened her laptop, and began. The Gan estate did not announce itself. That was the first thing Clara noticed as the agency's car turned off the main road and passed through a set of iron gates that opened with the quiet, hydraulic certainty of something that had never once needed to ask permission. No ostentatious signage, no architectural theatrics visible from the street. Just a long private drive lined with mature trees that had been there long enough to grow into their authority, and then, as the trees thinned, the house itself, a sprawling, low-slung structure of dark stone and glass that sat in its grounds the way powerful things often did. Completely still, completely sure of itself, not trying to impress anyone because it had long since moved past the point where other people's impressions were relevant. Clara took it in through the car window with the neutral, cataloging attention she had been practicing for 6 days. Entry points, sight lines. The positioning of the 2 men near the secondary gate who were dressed practically, but standing with the particular stillness of people whose job was to notice things. She counted windows on the east wing, noted the garden's relationship to the main house, close enough for visibility, structured enough to suggest the grounds were monitored. She had done her homework, but homework and arrival were 2 different things, and she had enough self-awareness to acknowledge, privately, that the Gan estate in person carried a weight that research alone could not fully prepare you for. The car stopped. Clara picked up her bag, straightened her jacket, and got out. Ms. Cho had arranged for her to be received by the estate's head of household staff, a woman named Mrs. Park. 60s, silver-streaked hair pulled back with architectural precision, a posture that suggested she had not entertained slouching since approximately 1987. She met Clara at the side entrance, not the main doors, Clara noted, which told her something immediate about the hierarchy of entry, and conducted the introductory tour with the brisk efficiency of a woman who considered unnecessary conversation a form of waste. The estate was larger inside than its exterior suggested. That was deliberate, Clara suspected. The ground floor ran through formal reception rooms that were immaculate and felt rarely used, a dining room scaled for serious occasions, a kitchen that was fully professional in its equipment and organization, and a series of staff corridors that connected everything with quiet, functional logic. The upper floors were private. Mrs. Park made that clear once, simply, without elaboration, and Clara understood that once was all she would need. Her room was in the staff wing, clean, spare, a window that looked out over the eastern garden. She unpacked methodically, hung her clothes in precise order, set her laptop on the desk, and sat for exactly 3 minutes doing nothing but listening to the sounds of the house settle around her. Footsteps on the floor above, the distant rhythm of kitchen activity. Somewhere further away, a door closing with the soft, expensive click of well-fitted wood. Then she stood, smoothed her jacket, and went to begin her first full day as someone she was not. The household ran on structure. That much was immediately evident. Meals at specific times, staff rotations that overlapped with practiced precision, a morning briefing that Mrs. Park conducted in the staff kitchen at 7:15 with the focused economy of a military debrief. Clara listened, asked 2 clarifying questions that demonstrated competence without drawing attention, and absorbed everything with the quiet, comprehensive attention she was careful not to make obvious. She met the other staff gradually throughout that first day. A cook named Minjung who was warm and efficient and communicated primarily through food, which Clara respected. 2 housekeeping staff who regarded her with the measured reserve of people who had learned not to invest too quickly in new arrivals. A groundskeeper who moved through the garden with the silent authority of someone who considered the outdoor spaces his jurisdiction and everyone else a temporary visitor to it. She did not see Gan Yonghee that first day. She did not see Jai Sung. She filed the absence of both and kept moving. She saw Sora. It happened in the mid-afternoon. Clara was in the main corridor outside the formal sitting room, reviewing the household inventory schedule on her tablet when she heard the voice first. Light, melodic, calibrated to a particular warmth, the kind of voice that had been deliberately practiced into sounding effortless. Mrs. Park, I was thinking the east sitting room flowers should be changed to white this week. I find the red ones a little, I don't know, aggressive. But of course, whatever you think is best, you always know better than I do. Clara kept her eyes on her tablet, but she was listening with everything she had. Mrs. Park's response was professionally neutral. Clara, who had already spent enough time with Mrs. Park to read her silences, understood that the neutrality was doing considerable work. Then Sora came around the corner and saw Clara. She was, in person, precisely what she had appeared to be at the gala, beautiful in a way that was clearly maintained at significant effort and expense, dressed in the kind of effortless casualness that requires a great deal of money to achieve. Her face, when she saw Clara, arranged itself immediately into an expression of open, curious warmth. "Oh, you must be the new coordinator." She extended her hand with the easy grace of a woman entirely comfortable being the most important person in any room. "I'm Sara. I've been so looking forward to meeting you." "Clara," Clara said. She shook the hand, held the eye contact for exactly the right duration, smiled in the way that she had learned long ago was the most useful kind of smile, pleasant enough to invite no suspicion, neutral enough to reveal nothing. "Clara," Sora repeated, as though tasting the name. "How are you finding everything so far? I always worry about new staff feeling overwhelmed. This house can be a lot. I try to make sure everyone feels supported." A small, self-deprecating laugh. "I know I'm not the boss around here. That's absolutely Mrs. Park's domain. I care about people, that's all." Everything is very well organized, Clara said. Mrs. Park runs an excellent household. Sora's smile didn't change, but something behind it did a microsecond adjustment, the way a lens shifts when the subject moves. Then it was gone, and the warmth was back, seamless and complete. She really does, Sora agreed. We're so lucky to have her. She touched Clara's arm briefly, light, familiar, the physical language of intimacy that hadn't been earned. If you ever need anything, please don't hesitate. My door is always open. Then she moved on down the corridor, and Clara watched her go and understood several things simultaneously. Sora was not careless. She was not simply vain or ambitious in the blunt, legible way that made people easy to read. She was precise. Every word in that exchange had been placed with the deliberate intention of a woman who understood that the most effective manipulation looks, from the outside, indistinguishable from warmth. The self-deprecation was strategic. It disarmed. The offer of support was positioning. It created obligation. The arm touch was territorial. It established, gently and plausibly, that Sora was someone whose good opinion mattered and whose displeasure you would prefer to avoid. Clara had met women like this exactly once before in her professional life. That encounter had cost someone she respected a great deal. She had watched it happen from the outside and had filed it away as one of the most instructive experiences of her career. She looked back down at her tablet. She was going to need to be very, very careful. Over the next 3 days, she watched Sora operate the way you watch something dangerous in its natural environment, with complete attention and no sudden movements. The patterns were elegant and consistent. In front of Gan Yonghee, Sora was devoted, solicitous, gently self-effacing in a way that made her appear entirely without agenda. She remembered his preferences, managed his schedule with apparent selflessness, spoke about him to staff with a practiced mix of admiration and tender concern that would have been convincing to anyone who wasn't watching the gap between what she said and what she did. The staff saw the other version. Not overtly, Sora was far too intelligent for overt. It was the comment that arrived wrapped in a compliment. The correction delivered as concern. The blame that migrated so smoothly you couldn't quite locate the moment it left her hands. Minjung, the cook, had developed a specific careful stillness whenever Sora entered the kitchen that Clara recognized as the body language of someone who had learned to make themselves small around a particular kind of danger. And every afternoon, at the same time, Sora prepared tea. A private blend she kept in her personal cabinet, that she mixed herself with quiet, domestic attentiveness, that she carried personally to wherever Gan Yonghee happened to be, with a smile that reached her eyes and hands that never once trembled. Clara watched her do it for the 3rd time on Thursday afternoon and felt something cold and certain settle in her chest. She needed access to that cabinet, and she needed it soon. Sora is a master of gaslighting, smiling in your face while plotting your ruin. If you hate manipulators who play the victim, subscribe to stand against them and comment, truth wins. The library was on the ground floor of the West Wing, separated from the main household corridors by a short hallway that turned once and then ended at a heavy door with a brass handle that had been polished so many times it had lost all its edges. Clara had identified it on her 2nd day, noted its position relative to the rest of the ground floor, and filed it with the particular attention she reserved for things that might become useful later. On Friday morning, she made it useful. Her rationale was clean and professional and entirely defensible. The household inventory she had inherited from her predecessor was incomplete in several areas, and the library's contents had not been formally cataloged in over 2 years. She raised it with Mrs. Park at the morning briefing as a straightforward operational gap, the kind of detail that spoke well of a coordinator who understood that a well-run household did not tolerate ambiguity in its records. Mrs. Park approved it without hesitation. Clara collected her tablet and a fresh legal pad, and by 8:45 she was standing inside the library with the door open behind her and a very specific reason to be exactly where she needed to be. The room itself gave her a moment's pause. Floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, dark wood, books arranged with the kind of order that suggested someone had actually read them and then returned them correctly, which in Clara's experience was rarer than it should have been. A reading table in the center, 2 armchairs near the window. And the window itself, long, south-facing, looking out over the section of the garden that ran along the back of the house toward the secondary terrace, where, every afternoon without exception, the household staff set out the tea service for the hour before Gan Young-hee's evening schedule began. Clara stood at that window for 11 seconds. Then she opened her legal pad, sat down at the reading table where the angle to the window was clean and unobstructed, and began cataloging books. She was very good at doing 2 things at once. She was 3 shelves into the east wall, working with the methodical patience of a woman who understood that useful information rarely arrived quickly when the movement in the garden below caught her eye. Not from the terrace. From the far edge of the garden, near the low stone wall that divided the formal grounds from the kitchen garden beyond it. A small figure in a yellow cardigan, moving along the wall with the exaggerated casualness of a child, trying very hard to look like they weren't doing anything in particular. Jae-sung. Clara kept her posture neutral, kept her hands moving over the spines of books, watched. Jae-sung reached a section of the wall where several of the flat decorative tiles were set into the stone at intervals. A design detail, purely ornamental, the kind of thing you registered once and then stopped seeing entirely. The child crouched down, her back to the main house, and spent a moment with one of the lower tiles. Then she stood, smoothed her cardigan with the composed practicality that Clara was beginning to understand, was simply how Jae-sung moved through the world, and walked back the way she had come without looking up at the library window once. Clara waited 4 minutes. Then she set her legal pad on the table, picked up her tablet, and walked out of the library toward the garden as though she needed fresh air and a moment to recalibrate her inventory approach, which was a perfectly reasonable thing for a coordinator to do on a Friday morning. The tile Jae-sung had crouched beside was the 3rd from the left in the 2nd row from the ground. Clara found it without making it look like she was finding it. She crouched as though retying her shoe, ran 2 fingers along the tile's edge, and felt it immediately, the slight give of something recently disturbed. She worked the tile loose with the careful pressure of someone who had done similar things in contexts she did not discuss, and found behind it a small folded square of paper, tucked into the recess with the precise economy of a child who had thought this through properly. She pocketed it, replaced the tile, stood, and spent another 90 seconds looking at the garden with the expression of a woman simply appreciating the grounds. Then she walked back inside. She read the note in the staff bathroom with the door locked. Jae-sung's handwriting was small and extremely neat, the handwriting of a child who had been taught that how you presented something was part of what you were saying. The note was brief, 6 lines, and it told Clara 3 things she had not known before. The first was that Sora's private tea cabinet was not kept in her suite as Clara had assumed. It was kept in a small locked room adjacent to the kitchen, a room designated as a dry pantry, to which Sora had her own key, and which the kitchen staff had quietly stopped entering because Sora had made it clear, in her particular seamless way, that she preferred to manage that space personally. The second was that Gan Young-hee had missed 2 consecutive morning meetings with his senior staff in the past week. Jae-sung had overheard the household manager explaining this to someone on the telephone as a scheduling adjustment. Jae-sung, who apparently had her father's instinct for the gap between what people said and what they meant, did not believe it was a scheduling adjustment. The third thing the note contained was a time, 2:45 p.m. every day. That was when Sora prepared the tea, not at the service itself, which began at 4, but at 2:45 in the dry pantry alone for approximately 15 minutes before transferring the prepared blend to the formal tea caddy that went out to the terrace. Clara read the note twice. Then she folded it smaller than it had arrived and held it over the bathroom sink and burned it with the lighter she had started carrying on her second day, because she was a woman who understood that information was only protected when it left no physical record. She turned on the tap and washed the ash away and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. Jae-sung was 7 years old. She had designed a covert communication system using garden tiles and folded paper, and a level of operational patience that most adults Clara knew could not have sustained. She had identified the critical window, the relevant location, and the specific timing, and she had done it all while continuing to move through this household every single day with her cardigan neat and her composure intact, and her father none the wiser. Clara felt something move through her chest that was not quite admiration and not quite grief, but lived in the territory between the two. She dried her hands and went back to the library. From the library window that afternoon, at 4 o'clock precisely, she watched Sora carry the tea caddy out to the terrace with the unhurried grace of a woman performing devotion. She watched Sora pour. She watched Sora sit beside Gan Yonghee, who appeared, even from this distance, to carry a heaviness in his posture that Clara was increasingly certain had nothing to do with the demands of running an underworld empire, and everything to do with what was being administered to him in a cup he had no reason to distrust. She watched him drink. She watched Sora watch him drink, with an expression of tender attentiveness so precisely constructed it would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. Clara knew what she was looking at. She also knew now where the evidence lived: the dry pantry, Sora's key, 2:45 p.m., 15 minutes of unobserved preparation every single day. That was where whatever Sora was using would be traceable, not in the tea caddy, which was too visible and too accessible to be the primary storage point, in the source, in the locked room that the kitchen staff had quietly learned not to enter. She needed two things. She needed access to that room, and she needed something to document what she found there in a way that would be unimpeachable. Not suspicion, not inference, not a coordinator's hunch, but evidence clean enough to put in front of a man who would need absolute certainty before he believed that the woman beside him had been systematically, patiently, deliberately killing him. She turned from the window and picked up her legal pad. She had been in the Gan estate for 5 days. She had learned the household. She had found her sightline. She had established her communication channel with the only other person in this building who was telling the truth. Now she needed to move. If you believe the truth always deserves to come to light, unlike the poison Sora is hiding, smash that like button and comment, no secrets. Only manipulators stay silent. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice. He was not a man who announced himself with conversation. It was the quality of the silence that preceded him. The way the corridor outside the East Wing study seemed to reorganize itself slightly. The way 2 staff members she passed on her way to the linen inventory room both straightened almost imperceptibly, without appearing to notice they were doing it. Clara had grown up around enough authority to recognize its atmosphere before its source came into view. It moved ahead of him like weather. She had been in the Gan estate for 9 days and had managed, through a combination of careful timing and deliberate route selection, to remain professionally peripheral to Gan Yonghee himself. She had seen him at a distance 4 times, crossing the main hall on his way to the private meeting rooms, standing at the window of his study with his back to the corridor, very still, in the particular way of a man conducting an internal argument he wasn't yet ready to resolve. Once at the far end of the garden in the early morning, alone, hands in his pockets, looking at nothing she could identify. Each time she had observed him with the clinical attention of someone cataloging useful data, and then directed her eyes elsewhere before the observation became something less professional. She was rounding the corner of the East Corridor with a household scheduling file under one arm and her tablet in her other hand, her attention divided between the notes on her screen and the practical question of whether the linen inventory could be restructured to reduce the Tuesday bottleneck, when the corridor offered her no further opportunity to manage the situation. He came around the opposite corner at the same moment she came around hers, and the distance between them was simply not sufficient for either of them to do anything graceful about it. She stopped. He stopped. The file under her arm shifted, and she caught it with the reflex of someone whose hands generally knew what to do before her mind issued the instruction. They were close enough that she could see, for the first time, what distance had previously obscured, the texture of fatigue around his eyes, the specific quality of it that went beyond a difficult week and into something more accumulated and more serious. A tiredness that lived in the body rather than the schedule. He was, in person and at close range, more formidable and more human than either the gala version or the distant window version had prepared her for. Both of those things simultaneously, which was its own particular problem. Ms. Bennet. His English was precise and unaccented in the way of someone who had learned it seriously rather than incidentally. He had clearly been briefed on the new coordinator. Of course he had. Mr. Gann. She kept her voice level, her posture professionally composed. I apologize, I should have slowed at the corner. The fault is shared, he said, which was such a specifically measured response that she almost wanted to examine it as a separate object. He glanced at the file she had resettled under her arm. The household schedule. Linen inventory coordination. I'm looking at restructuring the Tuesday distribution to reduce the overlap with the kitchen deep clean. It creates a staffing pressure point that I think we can resolve with a minor timing adjustment. Something moved across his face, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. The expression of a man who had not expected a specific answer and had received one. Mrs. Park mentioned you were thorough, he said. I try to be useful, Clara said. He looked at her for a moment in the way that she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things, with a directness that didn't perform itself, that didn't announce its own intensity, that simply was. Most people, she suspected, found it unsettling. She kept her eyes level and let him look. How are you finding the household? He asked. It was a courtesy question, the kind that didn't necessarily expect a real answer. Clara gave him one anyway. It's a well-run estate. The staff are professional and the systems are sound. I've identified a few areas where the administrative structure could be tightened, but nothing that reflects poorly on how things have been managed. Mostly inherited gaps. A pause. You speak about a household the way most people speak about a business. Most well-run households are businesses, Clara said. The main difference is that the stakes are more personal. This time what moved across his face was less ambiguous. Not quite a smile. She suspected a full smile was something he rationed, but the suggestion of one, brief and genuine, that reached his eyes before it withdrew. It changed his face considerably. She noted this with the detached attention of a woman who was absolutely not going to let it become relevant information. Then something else happened. The fatigue she had clocked in the first few seconds reasserted itself, moving back across his features like a tide returning, and he shifted his weight slightly, just enough, in the way that bodies do when they are carrying pain they have learned to make invisible and occasionally fail. Clara tracked it with the peripheral precision of someone trained to notice what people worked not to show, and she understood immediately what she was seeing. His joints. His hands, perhaps. The kind of deep, systemic fatigue that came from a body that was quietly under assault and had been for long enough that the compensation mechanisms were beginning to cost him more energy than they saved. He was sicker than he looked from a distance, and he looked, from a distance, already not well. She filed it and kept her face neutral and said nothing, because there was nothing she could say. Not yet. Not here, in a corridor, 9 days into an infiltration that required her to remain invisible for just a little longer. I won't keep you, he said, back to the measured courtesy. Whatever the almost smile had briefly opened, it had closed again, efficiently, without apparent effort, the way a man closes things he has long practiced closing. Of course, Clara said. She stepped to the side to let him pass. He moved past her, and she kept her eyes on the middle distance, and she was nearly, back to the uncomplicated operational headspace she needed to be in when he stopped. Ms. Bennet. She turned. He was looking back at her from 3 paces down the corridor, and his expression was not quite readable, which she understood by now was simply its default state. But there was something in it. Something that sat just beneath the surface composure of a man who had spent a long time being unreadable and was, in this particular moment, not entirely succeeding. Jai Sung, he said. She seems less guarded lately. A brief pause, during which Clara kept her face completely still. I don't know what changed. I thought you should know in case you had something to do with it. Clara held the pause for exactly the right duration. She's a remarkable child, she said, very self-possessed. He looked at her for another moment. Yes, he said quietly, she is. Then he turned and walked away down the corridor, and Clara listened to the sound of his footsteps fade and stood very still in the East Wing hallway with her tablet and her file, and the specific, inconvenient awareness of a woman who has just been reminded that the person she is trying to save is not an abstraction. He was a man who noticed that his daughter was less guarded and thought to mention it to the new staff member who might have had something to do with it, because he was paying attention even when everything in his body was working against him. He was a man whose almost smile changed his face entirely and who rationed it like something finite and therefore precious. He was a man who was being quietly killed by someone he trusted, in his own home, at his own table, one cup of tea at a time. Clara started walking. She had the dry pantry on her list for tomorrow. She had identified a window in Sora's schedule, a 40-minute gap on Tuesday mornings when Sora left the estate for what the household calendar listed as a personal appointment. 40 minutes was sufficient. She had worked with less. But the corridor had done something she had not budgeted for and was now obliged to manage carefully. It had made Gan Young-hee specific. Not a file. Not a target to be protected. Not the powerful, unreachable man from the gala or the distant figure at the garden window. A specific person with a specific weariness and a daughter he was paying attention to even while he was being systematically destroyed. That was the dangerous kind of specific. Clara knew exactly what to do with dangerous things. She kept moving. Tuesday came with gray skis and the particular stillness of a morning that had not yet decided what it intended to become. Clara was in the dry pantry by 9:43. Sora had left the estate at 9:15 in the back of a black car that Clara had watched from the staff corridor window with the focused calm of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment for 6 days. She gave it 20 minutes, enough time for the car to clear the district and for the household to settle back into its regular Tuesday rhythm. And then she collected her tablet and her small personal camera, which looked like a phone and functioned as one but had capabilities that went somewhat beyond the standard consumer model, and walked to the kitchen wing with the unhurried purpose of a coordinator who needed to cross-reference pantry inventory against the weekly supply delivery. The lock on the dry pantry was a standard residential deadbolt, which told her that Sora's confidence in this space rested primarily on staff compliance rather than genuine security. Clara had it open in 40 seconds. She was not proud of the skill exactly, but she had stopped being surprised by its usefulness. Inside, the room was cool and ordered and smelled of dried herbs and something underneath that chemical and faintly sweet in the way that things that should not be sweet sometimes were. She photographed everything methodically. The shelves, the arrangement of containers. The small locked tea caddy on the second shelf from the top, which she opened with the same quiet efficiency as the door, and which contained, nested inside a bed of loose orthodox tea, a secondary sealed container she would not have found if she hadn't been looking for something exactly like it. The container held a fine pale powder that had no label and no reason to exist in a household tea caddy. She photographed it from 6 angles. She used the small evidence kit she had been carrying in her coordinator's bag since day 3, because she had always believed in being prepared for the confirmation of things she already suspected, to collect a sealed sample. She replaced everything with precise, unhurried care, relocked both locks, and was back at her desk in the administrative office 14 minutes after she had entered the pantry. She had what she needed. She sent the sample to a D's contact in Seoul by courier that afternoon, with instructions for urgent independent laboratory analysis. And then she sat with the photographs backed up in 3 separate encrypted locations and felt, for the first time since the gala, that the weight of what she was carrying had acquired a shape she could work with. What she had not accounted for was Wednesday. Wednesday arrived clear and cold, and shattered itself open at 2:17 in the afternoon. Clara was crossing the main hall toward the west corridor when she heard it, not an alarm, not shouting, but the specific compressed sound of controlled professional movement that registered in her nervous system before her conscious mind had fully processed it. Boots on the service entrance gravel. The soft, tactical communication of people who had trained to move through spaces without unnecessary noise. More than one. More than two. She stopped walking. The first one came through the service corridor entrance with the practiced efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this floor plan, and Clara understood in the space of a single second and a half that these were not opportunistic intruders. They were tactical. They had a plan. They had numbers. And they had come, specifically, for the man currently in his study at the end of the east corridor. She was already moving before she completed the thought. She took the east corridor at a controlled pace that looked, to anyone who saw her, like purposeful staff movement rather than interception, which was important because there were still 2 members of the household in visible range, and she needed the next 90 seconds to be quiet. She counted footsteps behind her. 2 sets, east corridor gaining. Another set west, which meant they had split at least 3 visible, which meant a minimum of 3 more in supporting positions outside. 6, probably. The standard configuration for a targeted residential operation of this scale. She knew things about standard configurations for targeted residential operations. She had not mentioned this in her He-1 staffing interview. She reached the study door, opened it without knocking, stepped inside, and closed it behind her in one motion. Gan Yonghee looked up from his desk with the expression of a man whose staff knew better than to enter without announcement. Then he read something in her face, and the expression changed entirely. "Get away from the desk," Clara said. Quiet, absolute, the voice she used when there was no time for questions. "Move to the interior wall, now." He stood. He did not ask why. She revised her assessment of him upward and moved to the window. 2 outside, east garden, positioned at the corners of the building, suppression placement, designed to prevent exit and cut off external communication. She turned back. Gan Yonghee was against the interior wall, watching her with the focused attention of a man recalibrating everything he thought he knew about his household coordinator. "Who are you?" he said. "Right now I'm the person keeping you alive," Clara said. "We can discuss the rest later." The door came in at 2:21. The first man through was large and professional, and made the mistake of expecting a domestic space and a civilian. Clara was neither of those things. She had the door's momentum working for her before he'd fully cleared the frame, used it to redirect his entry into the wall with a controlled force that was efficient and unambiguous, and had his weapon reoriented away from Gan Yonghee in the same movement. The second man through was faster and had assessed the first man's failure in real time, which made him more dangerous. She respected it. She also dropped him with the economical precision of someone who had learned from people who could not afford to waste motion, using the architectural geometry of the doorframe and his own forward velocity as primary instruments. The third came from the connecting room, the interior access she had noted on her mental floor plan and had hoped, briefly, they wouldn't know about. They knew about it. She took a blade across her left forearm in the first exchange, which was the cost of a half-second miscalculation she immediately filed away for later, and resolved the situation with a combination of close-quarters technique that would have been difficult to explain to someone who hadn't spent 3 years learning it from people whose names she had never been given. She was aware, at the edges of her concentration, that Gan Yonghee had not stayed against the wall. He had moved, not in panic, not randomly, but with the controlled purposefulness of a man who had not arrived at his particular position in the world by waiting passively for outcomes. He had acquired the first man's secondary weapon and positioned himself with a clear sightline to both entry points, covering her flanks with the steady competence of someone for whom this was not entirely unfamiliar territory either. They did not speak. They did not need to. The situation had its own language and they were both fluent in it. The remaining 3 came fast and together, which was the correct tactical decision and also insufficient. Clara was operating in a state she had no good civilian word for not calm exactly, but the thing underneath panic that exists when the body trusts itself completely and the mind clears entirely to the immediate geometry of the problem. She was precise. She was cold. She was more capable than anyone in this room had prepared for, including, she suspected, herself on some ordinary Tuesday when she was reviewing linen inventory and pretending to be someone manageable. It was over in 4 minutes. The study was very quiet afterward. Clara stood in the middle of it and took a single measured breath and re-entered the ordinary texture of time, which always felt slightly strange after an interval like that. Her left forearm was bleeding with the steady, committed persistence of a wound that intended to be taken seriously. She pressed her sleeve against it. Gan Yonghee was looking at her from across the room. The weapon was lowered. His expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, not frightened, but stripped of its architecture in the way that extreme events sometimes stripped things, leaving only what was actually underneath. "Clara Bennett," he said slowly, "household coordinator." "It's complicated," Clara said. He looked at the 3 incapacitated men on the floor of his study, then back at her. "I imagine it is." His eyes moved to her arm. Something shifted in his face, not the professional assessment of a moment ago, but something more immediate and less guarded. He crossed the room, and she let him. Because she was running on adrenaline, and the wound was genuinely beginning to make its objections known. "Sit down," he said. His voice had changed, still measured, but closer. "Please." Clara sat. Only cowards attack from the shadows to get what they want. If you stand for bravery and refuse to back down from bullies, comment "justice" below. He knew where the medical kit was without looking for it. That detail registered with Clara in the way that small, specific details registered when her mind was running on the clear, stripped-down frequency that followed high-intensity situations. He knew where it was because he had needed it before, probably more than once, probably in rooms not entirely unlike this one. He retrieved it from the lower drawer of the mahogany cabinet beside the window with the practiced ease of a man for whom a medical kit in the study was not an unusual provision, but a reasonable one. And he brought it to where she was sitting and set it on the desk beside her without ceremony. She had rolled her sleeve up. The cut was clean, blade wounds usually were, which was the one civil thing about them, approximately 4 centimeters, deep enough to require attention, not deep enough to be the emergency her arm was currently campaigning for. She had assessed it with the matter-of-fact detachment she applied to most things that were happening to her own body, and arrived at the conclusion that it was manageable, which it was. Gan Yonghee arrived at the same conclusion via his own assessment, which he conducted with a directness that did not perform concern, but clearly felt it. He opened the kit, found the antiseptic, and looked at her once, a brief, asking look, before he applied it. She nodded. He worked with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who understood that rushing a thing you needed to do correctly was a particular kind of waste. She let him, partly because the forearm genuinely required it, and partly because the study had settled into a quiet that felt, strangely, less tense than the quiet it had contained before the door came in. As though the violence had cleared something from the air. As though they were both, for this moment, operating without the architecture they usually maintained between themselves. "You trained somewhere," he said, not a question. He was pressing a gauze pad against the cut with steady, even pressure. "Several somewheres," Clara said. "Before the coordinating." The coordinating was never the whole picture. He was quiet for a moment. His hands were precise and careful, and she was engaged in the moderately demanding task of not finding this as affecting as it was. "Who sent you?" he asked. Still the same measured tone, but underneath it something that was doing careful, controlled work. "No one sent me," Clara said. "I sent myself." He looked up at that. "Jai-sung spoke to me at the gala," Clara said. "She told me what she'd observed. I couldn't unknow it, so I came." The hands stilled for just a moment. Then they resumed their work. When he spoke again, his voice was level, but the levelness was costing something. "She told a stranger." "She told the only person in that room who was listening," Clara said. "She's been carrying this alone for a long time. She needed someone to receive it." He said nothing. He secured the gauze with medical tape and sat back slightly and looked at his own hands for a moment in the way people sometimes look at their hands when they are processing something they cannot yet translate into words. Clara had seen that look before. It was the look of a parent confronting the distance between how they understood their own situation and how their child had been experiencing it. She gave him the moment. She did not fill it. Then she reached into the interior pocket of her coordinator's jacket and removed her phone. "I need to show you something," she said. "All of it, and I need you to look at it properly." He raised his eyes to her face. "Whatever you're about to tell me," he said carefully, "I want to know if you're certain. I wouldn't be showing you if I weren't." He held her gaze for another second. Then he nodded once, with the focused gravity of a man who understood that what came next was going to require him to be a particular kind of steady, and was preparing accordingly. Clara opened the photographs. She walked him through it in the order she had assembled it, because order mattered. Evidence presented without structure was just information, and information without structure was easy to deflect or deny. She had learned this from people who built cases for a living, in contexts she did not detail, and she applied the principle now with the same precision she had applied to everything else inside this house. The dry pantry first. The layout, the shelf arrangement, the tea caddy's position, establishing the geography before the substance, so that when she arrived at the substance it existed within a physical reality he could place and verify himself. He looked at each photograph with the concentrated attention of a man reading a document he intended to remember, which was, she was learning, simply how he looked at things that mattered. Then the secondary container. She watched his face when she reached that photograph. He did not react in the way that people sometimes reacted to things they had suspected and had been avoiding confirming. There was no relief in the recognition, none of the complicated release of a suspicion finally validated. What moved across his face was something quieter and harder, the expression of a man encountering a truth he had genuinely not allowed himself to reach. "I had the contents independently analyzed," Clara said. "The laboratory report came back yesterday." She opened the email on her phone. She had printed nothing. Physical documents in this house were a liability she wasn't prepared to accept, but the report was detailed and unambiguous in the way that proper laboratory analysis was when conducted by people whose professional reputation rested on accuracy. She turned the phone toward him. He read it. He read it again. She watched him read it a second time with the still, comprehensive attention of a man, making absolutely sure he was understanding what he was understanding before he allowed himself to respond to it. The compound identified was a heavy metal derivative, cumulative and slow-acting, designed to be administered in small quantities over an extended period in a way that produced symptoms, fatigue, joint pain, cognitive fog, tremor, that presented convincingly as a stress-related condition or an unrelated degenerative illness. Difficult to identify without a targeted test. Virtually impossible to detect through standard medical examination unless a physician was specifically looking for it. The quantities in the container were consistent with months of sustained administration. He set the phone down on the desk. The study was very quiet. Clara watched him in the silence and did not speak, because this was not a moment that benefited from management. Some things needed to move through a person at their own pace, and this was one of them. The knowledge that someone you had trusted, had stood beside, had built a future around had been, with patience and deliberation and a smile calibrated to disarm you, administering poison to your body every afternoon. That knowledge did not resolve quickly or cleanly. It restructured things. It reached backward through time and recontextualized everything it touched, and that process was not brief. She watched him do it. She watched him sit with the full weight of it without collapsing under it, which told her something significant about the quality of his constitution. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and entirely controlled, which somehow made it more devastating than if it had broken. "How long?" he said. "Based on the compound's accumulation rate and your reported symptom timeline," Clara said, keeping her own voice steady and precise because he needed precision right now, not softness. "The laboratory estimates a minimum of 4 months, possibly longer." 4 months. He absorbed this without visible reaction, but she saw what it cost him in the slight tension at the line of his jaw and the way his hands, resting flat on the desk, pressed almost imperceptibly downward, as though he needed the solidity of something real. "Jae-sung knew before I did," he said quietly. "Jae-sung was watching when other people weren't looking," Clara said. "She's been watching for a long time." Something moved across his face that was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him yet. Not grief exactly. Something that encompassed grief and went further, the specific anguish of a parent realizing the weight their child had been carrying without adequate protection. It lasted only a moment. Then he collected himself with the practiced efficiency of a man who had long ago learned to process difficult things inward rather than outward. He looked at Clara. "You came into my house," he said slowly, "infiltrated my staff, collected evidence, and tonight prevented what I suspect was a professionally coordinated assassination attempt." A pause. "For Jae-sung." "For Jae-sung," Clara confirmed. Then, after a brief moment, "And because it was the right thing to do." He looked at her for a long time in the way she had grown accustomed to, that direct, unhurried, completely unperformative attention. But this time, there was something additional in it. Something that had not been there in the corridor, or at the gala, or in any of the careful distances they had maintained inside this house. "You're bleeding through the gauze," he said quietly. Clara looked down. He was right. He reached for the medical kit again, and she let him, and the study remained very quiet around them, and neither of them said anything else for a while, which felt, in its own way, like a great deal was being said. She knew it was coming before he said it. It was in the way the house changed overnight, subtle shifts in the operational texture that Clara, who had spent 11 days learning to read this estate the way other people read weather, registered with the quiet, resigned accuracy of someone who had always understood that her presence here had a shape, and that shape had always had an ending. Additional security personnel arrived before dawn, moving through the grounds with the coordinated precision of a team that had been briefed thoroughly and deployed quickly. 2 of Gan Young-hee's senior men were in the east reception room by 6 in the morning, and the low, structured cadence of their conversation reached the staff corridor as a sound without specific words, which was enough. The household was being reorganized around a new reality. She had known, when she walked into this estate 11 days ago, that her exit was not hers to control. You did not infiltrate the private world of a man like Gan Young-hee, blow your cover in the most definitive possible way, and then negotiate your own departure terms. The infiltration had always contained this moment as an inevitable coordinate. She had already packed before Mrs. Park came to find her. Mrs. Park delivered the message with the composed, neutral efficiency she brought to everything, which Clara appreciated more than a softer approach would have allowed. She was to be collected at 10 o'clock. A car would take her to a hotel in Mapo, secure, arranged and paid for, the details managed entirely by the Gan household. She was to remain there until further notice, for her own safety, while the situation was addressed. Mrs. Park said the situation, in the tone of a woman who had worked in this household long enough to understand that some things were accurately communicated through careful omission. Clara thanked her. Mrs. Park held her gaze for a moment longer than the transaction required, and something moved through the older woman's expression, not quite acknowledgement, not quite gratitude, but something that lived in the territory between them and understood itself without needing to be named. Then she left. Clara sat on the edge of her bed in the staff room with her bag packed beside her and looked at the window and the garden beyond it and allowed herself, for approximately 4 minutes, to simply feel the full weight of what the past 11 days had been. Not process it, not organize it into something manageable, just feel it, the sustained tension, the precision required, the corridor collision that had made everything specific, the study that had gone quiet in a way that said more than either of them had articulated. The forearm that throbbed steadily beneath fresh gauze and would carry a scar that she would look at for years and know exactly what it meant. 4 minutes, then she stood, picked up her bag, and went to find Jae-sung. She found her in the garden, which was where she had always found her. At the low stone wall near the kitchen garden, in her yellow cardigan despite the cold. Crouched beside the tile communication system she had designed with the operational ingenuity of a child who had run out of adults she could trust and had decided to become her own infrastructure. Jae-sung heard her coming and looked up, and her face did the thing that Clara had observed it do only rarely in 11 days. It abandoned its composure entirely. Not dramatically. Just the small, specific collapse of a child's careful self-possession in the presence of the one person around whom she had decided she didn't need to maintain it. Clara sat down on the low wall beside her. She did not crouch to the child's level in the performative way of adults who wanted to seem accessible. She simply sat, the way she had pulled out a chair at the gala, and let Jae-sung decide what came next. Jae-sung sat beside her. Their shoulders were almost touching. "You're leaving," Jae-sung said. Not a question. She had always been precise about the difference. "Yes," Clara said. "Because it's not safe. Because your father wants to make sure I'm protected while he handles what comes next." Jae-sung considered this with the careful, thorough attention she gave to information she intended to trust. "He knows," she said quietly. "He knows about the tea." "He knows everything," Clara said. "You were right. You were right about all of it, and now the right people have the evidence and it is going to be handled." The garden was very still around them. Somewhere on the other side of the estate, Clara could hear the low sound of vehicles and organized movement, Gan Young-hee's world realigning itself around a new set of facts. Jae-sung heard it too and looked briefly toward the sound and then back at her lap. "I was scared," Jae-sung said, with the specific plainness of a child making a confession they have been holding for a long time. "I kept telling myself I wasn't, but I was." "I know," Clara said. "I didn't know if anyone was going to listen. I tried to tell." She stopped, pressed her lips together for a moment in a way that suggested the next sentence was one she had decided, somewhere along the way, to stop finishing. "I tried other people first," she said instead, "before the gala." Clara felt something move through her chest that had edges. "I know," she said again, because it was the truest thing she had, and sometimes the truest thing was also the only adequate one. "But you listened," Jae-sung said. She said it simply, without accusation toward the others, without performance of gratitude toward Clara. Simply as a fact she was recording accurately. "You listened." "You made it very easy to listen," Clara said. "You were clear and you were specific and you were brave in a way that most adults aren't. What you did, the tiles, the notes, the timing, all of it. You built something that worked, Jae-sung, because you were careful and you didn't give up. That was you. I just showed up." Jae-sung was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the solemnity of someone issuing a verdict they have considered carefully, "We were a good team." Clara looked at her. The cardigan with its pearl buttons, the pigtails, the face that held behind its extraordinary composure, everything a 7-year-old should not have been required to carry, and had carried anyway, without adequate help, for long enough that she had built her own covert communication system out of garden tiles and folded paper because the adults around her had not been equal to what she needed. "We were," Clara said, "the best." Jae-sung nodded slowly. Then she reached into the pocket of her cardigan and produced a small object that she held out to Clara on her open palm, a single flat tile, pale stone, a small irregular marking on its surface where the garden wall had worn it unevenly. One of the communication tiles. Clara looked at it, then at Jae-sung. "So you don't forget," Jae-sung said, still perfectly composed, still precise, only the slight overbrightness at the edges of her eyes betraying what the composure was managing. Clara took the tile. She closed her hand around it and held it and did not look away from Jae-sung's face, because this child had earned the dignity of being looked at directly. "I'm not going to forget," Clara said. "Not any of it, not you." Jae-sung's composure held for another 3 seconds. Then it didn't, and she was 7 years old and she had been frightened for a long time, and she had spent 11 days sharing that fear with the one adult who had listened, and that adult was leaving. She didn't cry loudly. She wasn't built for loud. This child, everything in her ran deep and quiet, but her face crumpled in the way that children's faces crumple when they have been strong for longer than they should have needed to be. And Clara put her arm around her without deliberation and held her with the simple, uncomplicated warmth of a woman who had been trying to stay detached for 11 days and had failed entirely and was finished pretending otherwise. Jae-sung held on with both hands and said nothing, and Clara held on back, and the garden was cold and still around them, and it was enough, and it wasn't enough, and it was what they had. When Jae-sung pulled back, she wiped her face with the sleeve of her cardigan and reassembled her composure with the determined practicality of someone who had decided that was sufficient and they were moving forward. She looked at Clara steadily. "Will you come back?" she asked. Clara looked at her for a long moment. She was a precise woman. She did not make promises she couldn't structure. But she had discovered over the course of 11 days in this estate, and one corridor, and one quiet study, and one garden wall, a woman whose carefully maintained detachment had been thoroughly and permanently dismantled by a 7-year-old in a yellow cardigan. "Yes," she said. Jae-sung searched her face, found what she was looking for. "Okay," she said quietly. She smoothed her cardigan. Then she reached over and adjusted Clara's collar, which didn't need adjusting, in the small proprietary gesture of someone establishing that they had a claim on a person's return. The car came at 10 o'clock exactly. Clara walked to it with her bag over her shoulder and the tile in her pocket, and did not look back until she reached the gate. And when she did, Jae-sung was still standing at the garden wall, small and upright and composed, one hand raised in a gesture that was too dignified to be a wave and too warm to be anything else. Clara raised her hand back, then she got in the car. Sora tried to use an innocent child to further her greed. If you can't stand people who target the vulnerable, subscribe to protect those who can't speak for themselves. Sora returned to the estate at 11:43. Gan Young-hee knew the exact time because he had been informed of it the moment her car turned onto the private drive, and he had been sitting in the main reception room since 10 o'clock. Since the moment Clara's car had passed through the gate going in the opposite direction. With a cup of tea, he had not touched, and the laboratory report open on the table in front of him, because he had decided that morning that he was done looking away from things that required looking at directly. He heard her footsteps in the entrance hall, the particular rhythm of them, unhurried, confident, the walk of a woman who considered this house her territory and had no reason yet to think otherwise. He heard her exchange a brief pleasantry with the staff member near the door in the warm, practiced way she exchanged pleasantries with everyone who might one day be useful to her. Then the reception room door opened, and she came in carrying a small shopping bag and wearing an expression of uncomplicated ease, and she saw him sitting there, and the ease shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have been visible to anyone who hadn't spent the past several hours studying the specific architecture of her performance, into something recalibrated and careful. "Young-hee," warm, slightly surprised. "I didn't know you'd be in here, I was just going to." "Sit down, Sora," he said. She read his tone with the quick, accurate intelligence he had always known she possessed and had, he understood now, consistently underestimated the application of. She sat. She set the shopping bag beside her chair with the composed deliberateness of a woman deciding, in real time, which version of herself this situation required. He watched her make the calculation. He had watched her make 100 calculations in the time they had been together, and had, he understood now, consistently interpreted them as something else. He slid the laboratory report across the table toward her. He did not speak. He wanted to see, without the interference of words, what her face did when it encountered the thing she had been careful to keep from him, for the laboratory estimate settled again in his chest like a stone, a minimum of 4 months. She looked at the document. He watched the performance end. It didn't end loudly. That would have been inconsistent with who she was. It ended in the small, specific way that a sophisticated structure ends when its load-bearing assumption is removed. A subtle collapse of the scaffolding, a brief moment where the face beneath the face became visible before she could reassemble the exterior. In that moment, he saw something he had not seen from her in all the time he had known her. Not guilt, precisely. Something colder than guilt. the expression of someone who had been caught not in an act of passion or desperation, but in the execution of a long, patient plan, and who was now, with the same cold intelligence that had designed the plan, assessing the most viable response to its exposure. She looked up, she met his eyes, and she made, he saw, the decision to try. "This isn't what you think," she said. Her voice was steady. Exactly as steady as it needed to be to sound like a woman who had been wrongly accused and was working to remain calm despite the injustice of it. He had heard that voice applied to other situations many times. He cataloged this now with a clarity that felt, in its own way, like a physical sensation. The specific, structural clarity of a man who has removed every assumption he was previously operating under and is seeing the underlying geometry of things for the first time. "Then tell me what it is," he said. She told him. She was skilled and she was precise, and she constructed the alternative version of events with the architectural care of someone who had prepared for this contingency, which she had. He understood this as she spoke, that the contingency had been prepared for, that she had designed the plan with its potential exposure already accounted for, that even this conversation had been mapped in advance. She spoke about the powder as a supplement, about a health protocol she had been researching privately, about her concern for him that had led her to act unilaterally without consulting him, because she knew how he resisted anything that implied vulnerability. She made the narrative sympathetic. She made herself a woman motivated by love and overreach rather than calculation and malice. It was, he thought, genuinely impressive. 3 months ago, 2 months ago, he was not certain he would have been able to identify the seams. But the laboratory report was on the table between them, and Jai Sung's face was in his mind, his daughter, 7 years old, who had watched this woman administer something to his tea every afternoon, and had tried to tell him and had been told, gently, by the adults in his world, that she was a child who missed her father's attention and was creating stories to account for it. He had not said those words himself, but he had not interrupted the people who had. He let Sora finish. Then he said, very quietly, "Jai Sung told me. Before anyone else knew, before anyone was looking, my daughter saw what you were doing and she told me, and I didn't listen carefully enough." The name landed on Sora's face in a way she hadn't prepared for. Jai Sung had been, he understood now, a variable she had consistently underestimated. The child had been so quiet, so contained, so much easier to interpret as simply sad or difficult or needing professional attention than as someone who was watching with comprehensive accuracy and would, eventually, find the one person willing to receive what she had to say. The alternative narrative collapsed. Not all at once, she was too skilled for all at once, but structurally, irreversibly. What followed was not a long conversation. He had not arranged it to be one. His senior men were in the house, and the conversation had an end point he had determined before she walked through the door, and when they reached it, he was precise and he was final, and he did not raise his voice, because he had never needed volume to communicate that something was over. Sora was given 2 hours to collect personal items from her suite, supervised. She was not given access to the dry pantry or any other shared space. She was escorted from the estate at 2:15 in the afternoon in the same black car she had arrived in that morning, which felt like a symmetry that the situation had arranged for itself. She did not go quietly in the emotional sense. There were words, toward the end, that shed the carefully constructed warmth entirely and revealed the cold, furious intelligence beneath it. He received them without reaction. He had expected them. The mask, once it comes off under pressure, tends to stay off. He stood at the window of the east wing and watched the car move down the private drive and through the iron gates, and then he stood there for a while longer, looking at the garden. The hardest part was not the betrayal, though the betrayal was significant. The hardest part was the retrospective audit, the process, which had begun the night before and would continue for some time, of moving back through the accumulated months and re-examining what he had dismissed. The fatigue he had attributed to stress. The tremor he had mentioned to a physician who had suggested he sleep more. The cognitive fog during meetings that he had managed by preparing more thoroughly, by compensating with structure, by refusing to acknowledge that something was wrong, because acknowledging it would have required a vulnerability he had not been prepared to extend. And behind all of that, consistently, quietly, in a yellow cardigan with her legs dangling above the floor, his daughter. Watching, knowing, trying. He thought about Jae-sung sitting with a stranger at a gala, and whispering a secret she had been carrying alone for long enough that she had built her own system for carrying it. He thought about garden tiles and folded paper, and the specific bravery of a child who had run out of people to trust, and had looked across a room full of important, powerful, connected individuals, and chosen a woman standing alone in a corner drinking her drink like the party was unremarkable. His daughter had better instincts than everyone in his organization combined. He intended to tell her this. He also intended to tell her that he was sorry it had taken this long for someone to listen, and that it would not happen again, and that she had done everything right, and that she did not have to be that careful anymore. He left the window. He walked through the house to the garden, where Jae-sung was sitting on the low stone wall near the kitchen garden in her yellow cardigan, looking at the space where one of the tiles was slightly askew from recent use. She looked up when she heard him coming. Her face was cautious in the particular way it had become cautious with him over the past months, that careful management of expectation that he understood now for what it was, and that was going to take time to undo. He sat down on the wall beside her. He was a man who was not accustomed to the right words arriving easily, but he was also a man who had spent the morning understanding the specific cost of substituting silence for the things that needed to be said. "Jae-sung," he said quietly. She waited. "I'm sorry I didn't listen sooner," he said. "You were right. You were right the whole time, and I should have heard you, and I'm sorry." Jae-sung looked at him for a long moment with those eyes that were too old for her face and too honest for the world she had been born into. Then she leaned against his arm, slowly, with the careful, tentative quality of someone re-extending a trust they had pulled back for good reason. He put his arm around her. They sat on the wall together in the cold garden, and he held his daughter, and the estate was quiet around them, and he made, in the silence, the particular kind of decision that doesn't announce itself but reorganizes everything from the inside out. Some things, he understood now, mattered more than the empire. It had taken a woman in a corridor and a child with a garden tile to make that clear. He was not going to forget it. London received her the way it always did. Gray and certain and entirely indifferent to what she had been through, which was, in its own way, a comfort. The city did not adjust itself for returning travelers. It did not make space for the disorientation of someone who had left as one version of themselves and arrived back as something she hadn't yet found the right word for. It simply continued. The traffic, the particular quality of the cold, the specific rhythm of a place that had been going about its business for centuries, and intended to keep doing so regardless of what any individual had experienced in Seoul in the past 3 weeks. Clara took a cab from Heathrow. She watched the city reassemble itself outside the window with the familiar, steady accumulation of recognizable things. The bridge, the buildings, the gray curve of the Thames doing what rivers did, moving forward without sentiment. And she thought about the Han River, which moved the same way, and then stopped thinking about the Han River because that line of thought had a destination she wasn't prepared to arrive at in the back of a cab. Her flat was exactly as she had left it. Clean, organized, the particular stillness of a well-maintained space that had been empty for 3 weeks and had managed this perfectly well without her. She set her bag down in the entrance and stood in the quiet of it for a moment. The flat was, by any reasonable measure, a good flat. It reflected her completely. The clean lines, the absence of unnecessary objects, the bookshelves arranged with the same precision she brought to everything she considered worth maintaining. It had always felt like enough. She noticed, standing in the entrance with her bag at her feet, that it felt smaller than she remembered. She unpacked. She made coffee. She sat at her desk and opened her laptop and began working through 3 weeks of accumulated correspondence with the focused efficiency that had always been her primary instrument for processing difficult things. There was a significant amount to address. The 2 deals she had closed in Seoul needed documentation. The third required a follow-up call. There were 4 new inquiries from suppliers she had been cultivating for months, and her business partner had left a series of messages that ranged in tone from professionally curious to mildly concerned too. In the final one, simply asking if she was all right in the direct way of someone who knew her well enough to ask directly. She replied to everything. She was thorough and precise and professionally engaged, and by 8 o'clock that evening, she had reduced her inbox to a manageable state and had drunk 3 cups of coffee and had not, she noted, thought about the corridor or the study or the garden for nearly 4 consecutive hours, which was progress of a kind. Then she made the mistake of sitting still. It arrived in the quiet, the way things do when you have been filling space with activity and then run out of activity to fill it with. Not dramatically. She was not a woman built for dramatic internal experiences, or had not thought she was, but with the steady, comprehensive quality of something that had been patient while she was busy and was now simply present. She thought about Jae-sung first. That was the easier direction, or the more acceptable one, the one she could examine without the particular discomfort that came with the other direction. She thought about the yellow cardigan and the garden wall and the tile that was sitting on her desk right now, pale stone with an irregular worn marking, which she had unpacked first without making a conscious decision to do so, and positioned where she could see it from her chair, which she also had not made a conscious decision about. She thought about Jae-sung leaning against her in the garden at the end, with the careful, tentative quality of a child re-extending something she had pulled back. She thought about the raised hand at the gate, small and upright and composed. "Will you come back?" Yes. She had meant it when she said it. She meant it more now, sitting in a flat that felt smaller than she remembered, with the tile on her desk and the forearm scar that pulled slightly when she reached for her coffee cup, than she had standing at the gate in the cold Seoul morning, which was its own kind of information. She opened her phone. There was a message from an unsaved number that had arrived 2 days ago, while she was in transit, which she had seen and set aside with the disciplined intention of dealing with it once she was settled. She was, she decided, settled enough. She opened it. It was not long. He was not, she had learned, a man who used language as a performance. He used it as a tool, precisely, economically, for the purpose of conveying what needed to be conveyed and nothing extraneous. The message said that the situation had been resolved, that Jae-sung was well, that the estate was secure. That Clara's professional conduct throughout had reflected a standard of competence and integrity that he found. And here there was a pause encoded in the sentence structure, a slight shift in register that she read without difficulty, difficult to adequately acknowledge through conventional means. The final sentence said, "I hope London is treating you well. It seems very far away." Clara read it twice. Then she set the phone down on the desk beside the tile and looked at the middle distance for a moment. It seems very far away. From a man who said only what he meant, that sentence was doing considerable work. She called her business partner the next morning and had a conversation she had been restructuring in her mind since the cab from Heathrow. There were, she explained, some adjustments she needed to make to her schedule over the coming months. She would be traveling more than originally planned. Seoul, specifically and repeatedly, for reasons that were initially professional and then, after a pause during which her business partner, who was perceptive and had known her for a long time, said nothing with the pointed patience of someone waiting for the real sentence, personal. Her partner said, with the dry warmth of a person who had watched Clara maintain professional detachment across a decade, and had privately suspected it would eventually meet something it couldn't process, that this sounded like a significant development. Clara said it was a developing situation. Her partner said that developments which sent Clara Bennett to Seoul repeatedly with a pause in the middle of explaining them sounded less like a situation and more like a conclusion she hadn't admitted to yet. Clara said she would send the Q4 projections by Friday. Her partner laughed. Clara ended the call and sat with the quiet of the flat around her and the tile on her desk and the message on her phone and the forearm that pulled when she reached for things and the memory of a corridor and a study that had gone quiet in a way that had said more than either of them had articulated. She opened a new message. She wrote it with the same economy he had used, because she understood by now that this was the register between them. Precise, direct, without performance, the language of two people who had met in extraordinary circumstances and discovered that their baseline frequencies were, inconveniently and entirely, compatible. She wrote, "London is efficient. I prefer it when I have a reason to be here. I've been reviewing my schedule." She looked at it for a moment, added, because she was finished performing detachment she didn't feel, "Jae-sung should know her system worked. She deserves to hear that from me directly." She sent it. She set the phone face down on the desk. She looked at the tile. The reply came in 4 minutes, which for a man who ran a significant criminal empire and had just survived a poisoning and a coordinated assassination attempt and the comprehensive restructuring of his personal life was, she reflected, extremely fast. It said, "She will want to show you the garden in spring. She has already mentioned it twice." And then, after a brief pause that arrived as a second message, "As have I." Clara read it. She looked at the tile. She looked at the scar pulling at the edge of her sleeve. She looked at the message for a long moment in the clean, organized quiet of a flat that was a perfectly good flat and reflected her completely, and had somehow, in 3 weeks, become insufficient. Then she opened her calendar and began moving things. Not everything required a long approach. Some conclusions arrived complete, and the only remaining question was the speed at which you were willing to move toward them. Clara was a precise woman, a structured woman, a woman who had spent years building a life on the discipline of not getting involved in things that couldn't be managed cleanly. She had failed at that comprehensively and thoroughly and without apparent regret. Seoul in 2 weeks. She blocked the dates with the decisive efficiency of a woman who had made up her mind and saw no further use in the pretense of considering alternatives. Then she closed the calendar, picked up the tile from her desk, and held it in her hand for a moment, pale stone, worn irregular marking, the weight of it small and certain and real. Jae-sung had built something that worked, in the dark, alone, because she believed the truth deserved to come to light, and she refused to stop until it did. She had chosen the right person at the gala with the instincts of someone who could not afford to be wrong, and she had not been wrong, and the distance between that yellow cardigan and this London flat was a distance that was already, in every meaningful sense, being closed. Clara set the tile back on her desk where she could see it. Then she got back to work. If you believe that corrupt people like Sarah should never win, share this video to expose the truth. We don't side with the villain here. Hit subscribe if you're with us.